This is meant for you.
Another for me. Now, we've all done it. So you're in a conversation somewhere in the Facebook comment section of who knows where, ABC, SBS, wherever. And you found yourselves an anti-vaxxer. And you're trying as hard as you possibly can to try and get across to them this idea of correlation versus causation. It's not really getting very far. What you keep getting back is, no, but Mercury, but Wakefield, but autism is terrible. You're kind of starting to lose hope at this point, and then it happens. My partner and me, we're never going to vaccinate our kids. Aha. That's it. That's your in. And you probably kind of know you shouldn't, but you're really running out of patience. You're really getting annoyed, and so it happens. So, this isn't actually anything new. People have been doing this for a really, really long time, since before the internet. So what I'm going to show you now is actually coming from the late 1800s. It's from the letters to the editor of a newspaper called the Argus, which is in Melbourne. It's kind of the precursor to the Age, if I understand correctly. And there's a huge argument going down that's gone down over a few weeks. And what they're arguing about is exactly who it is in Victoria who gets their vowels wrong. So this was just one letter to the editor, and it prompted a massive fight that went for about 3 weeks. There were about 160 different letters that came in until the newspaper shut it down. So we could say they closed the comments. It's Australia's first ever Facebook comments thread. So I'm going to read out loud to you what you're seeing here on the slides because they're scans from the actual newspaper. So if you can't read it, don't worry too much. Whoop. But one heads up I'll give you is you're going to see the word native here. And it's not used to describe Indigenous people. Obviously today we're speaking on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. We're not referring to Indigenous people here. What these people are referring to is Australians, white Australians who were born in Australia as opposed to being born in England, because at the time that was a really big deal. So just a heads up. And so the pseudonyms people are choosing for themselves, you'll see that they're referring to someone who's called themselves another native, by which they mean I was born in Australia. Okay, and slightly gloomy, I suppose. The reason why people were called this and then eventually reclaimed the name is because the English-born were using this on the Australian-born to try and indicate to them that they were considered to be as low as the Indigenous people. Anyway, moving on. So, I know it's very fuzzy. Bear with me. So this is from someone who signed themselves off as Cantab, and I don't know if this is a familiar term for people. It's used to indicate that you went to Cambridge. And so that's how they've signed themselves off. So Cantab says, if another native goes to Dublin, he will certainly hear more good English than in most places. I'm not Irish, but he would certainly hear more uniformly good English in any town in England than he can in Melbourne if he goes among the so-called well-educated classes. Did anyone spot a grammar error in there? I don't know, what you'd consider to be a grammar error. Next person, signing themselves off, an Australian. Sir, if a definite and practical result comes of the present discussion, you will have done colonial society a good service in permitting it. Did anyone find an error there? Error? Don't worry, because Englishman is here to save the day. So, Englishman has been going back and forth with both Cantab and an Australian for a while now, and he's not really winning. So, it is to be presumed from the nom de plume adopted that the writer has had the benefit of a Cambridge education, yet he, while criticising the Victorian manner of speaking, appears to be neglecting the proper application of the subjunctive mood. In more than one place, he has himself been guilty of murdering Queen's English in a most atrocious manner. So, you know, this is a little more long-winded than you'd get on Facebook, but yeah. Take, for example, the sentence, "if another native goes to Dublin." Surely Cantab's education must have been sadly neglected if he were not taught that the subjunctive mood should follow the word if, and that a third person singular of the present tense subjunctive mood of the verb to go is he go, not if he goes. Okay, for people who, I think there's a decent chunk of us who were never taught anything about the subjunctive in school, and it's not really that much of a thing in Australian English, but so for people who aren't familiar with this, the subjunctive is kind of a weird verb form that you sometimes use for something that's not definite, for something that's hypothetical, for something that might happen in the future. It's kind of on the way out in Australian English. We don't really do it that much. Another correspondent, an Australian, gives him away at once in his opening sentence by committing the same fault, viz. If a definite and practical result comes instead of if a definite and practical result come. Okay, so let's leave Englishmen there for now. So we're always doing this, we're always correcting people's grammar, admit it. And it's not particularly productive. I mean, for starters, it doesn't address the argument the other person is making at all. But we do it all the time. Why do we do it? Not for the reasons we think we are. So, bad news is there's no such thing as correct English. Sorry, the linguists have spoken. What we have is varieties of English. This is what linguists refer to. So a variety is kind of a subset of a language. It's not necessarily a dialect because that has its own definition. It's not necessarily a sociolect. We just bundle them all into varieties, and so we can talk about them in a fairly neutral way. But the variety that people are usually talking about when they're referring to correct English and getting things right is what we call standard Australian English, or standard English. So if we've gotten this far and you've taken away right, I'll stop calling people out for incorrect English. I'm going to start calling them out for non-standard English. Bad skeptic, no biscuit. So the standard variety has a few criteria for us to call it a standard variety. So the first one is that it's codified in writing, meaning that it's the kind you see most often in written form, particularly in formal writing. You'll see it codified in dictionaries. You'll see it codified in formal grammars. Second one is that it's taught in schools. And so this is where people get their idea of correctness from, because this is the variety that you grew up with. It's the variety that your teachers have been telling you your whole life is right, and if you got it wrong, you were marked down. The third one is that it's a variety that doesn't have a home. It's not linked to a particular geographical region or to a particular group of people. It's one that most of us who have this language are going to have access to. So one other thing about standard English is that most English speakers can use it. They just don't always. And we're a bit hesitant to say this as linguists sometimes because people then take the position you're able to, then so you should. But it's something that we're all exposed to. It's something we're exposed to, say, on newscasts, in the books we read, in our schools. And so that's what a standard variety is. But how it becomes a standard variety, because it's no better than any other. It doesn't have any intrinsic value that goes above and beyond the others. It becomes a standard variety because of power. So the one question that I prefer to ask, or prefer to have people ask when they think about this kind of thing, is who writes the dictionaries? Because they're the ones who are making these rules. So they're usually white. When it's English, they're usually men. They're usually older. They tend to be middle to upper class. Previously in history have been upper class. They tend to be of a much higher socioeconomic status in terms of the jobs that they hold, in terms of the money they've got. They tend to be cisgender, they tend to be heterosexual. And they tend to be the ones employed in educational institutions. And so these are the groups of people who are also our politicians for the most part. And so they're these groups that have higher status, they have higher prestige. And so the language that they speak, the way that they talk, generally becomes accepted as the way people should talk. The same way as other things go. So as a general rule, any kind of discrimination based on language, the judgments we make about language, they're just judgments about the people who are doing it. They're judgments about the users. We like to think that they're not about the users. We like to think that we're separating it from the people, but no. Okay. So, one argument I might hear from people is, yeah, sure, you know, it's the language of power and all that, but maybe those people in power picked it for a reason. Why? Maybe it's more logical. Maybe the structure of this standard variety just makes more sense. So, but isn't it just more logical? Nope. So, let's see. So as far as languages go, do we need to talk about the fact that no one language is more logical than any other language? We do. So, quick, this is potted linguistics in 90 seconds. So you'll get languages that do things that other languages don't, but we tend to perceive our own language as being the most logical one. So particularly if we've grown up monolingual, if we've grown up and our only language is English, we'll look at languages that don't do X thing that English does and we'll think, wow, that's really unsophisticated. Or we'll think, no, that's really not logical. And some will take it to the extreme of, clearly if their language doesn't do this thing that I understand, then that means they can't think in this way that I understand. So I don't know if people, I should probably do an entirely separate talk on this one. Economists trying to be linguists. So there was this guy called Keith Chen, who's an economist, a few years ago, and he put out an article where he'd very carefully studied the economies of assorted countries and compared them according to whether or not they have a future tense. Their languages have a future tense. He didn't really know what he was talking about when he was defining tenses, but that didn't stop him. And he concluded that the people who speak a language with no future tense don't know how to save money. So, and if he'd asked a linguist, we would have told him that tense has a very, very strict description. It's a strict definition. Tense has to be marked on the main verb. So if you use another word somewhere else in your sentence to mark the future, then that language doesn't have a future tense. It doesn't mean you can't talk about the future, it just means you haven't attached to this very specific verb. Yes, and our friend Keith did not take that criticism very well, including from the scholar, the senior scholar he cited in the definition of the future tense, who came back and said, that's really not what I was saying, can you stop saying my name? No, he came back and decided to school all of us linguists about what tense is. So one day I hope to repay the favour by being able to say to him, yeah, there's this thing called money. Anyway. So no language is more logical than any other language. Because all languages do the same things. They're all spoken by humans who need to talk about the same things, communicate the same ideas. They just do it in different ways. And sometimes those ways are trickier to see. And sometimes languages do things that are actually more logical or that make more sense. So for example, something you'll find in Australian languages and Aboriginal languages is they often have this thing called clusivity, where, so for our pronouns we have, I can say we're going to this party. That's it. In a lot of Australian languages, you can either say, we're going to this party, including you, or we're going to this party, but not you. And that's something that's encoded into the way you talk. And so they would probably find English to be a bit ambiguous and illogical. Anyway. So for this argument about varieties, an example that I'm going to assume that you're all on board with me now, and so that the argument I'm presenting now is something you can go and use to your disbelievers. Oh, so, an example. I saw that. I heard that. So, this is really common in Australian English. It's also a feature of Aboriginal English, this use. And you hear it, we hear it and we cringe because it's not what we're used to. And we go, oh no, it's gross, it sounds wrong, it's illogical, it doesn't work. But it's actually more logical than what we've got. So, everyone's familiar with these. These are our pronouns. So, first person, I am talking about myself. Second person, I am talking about you. Third person, I am talking to you about that person over there. And singular being one, plural being more than one. Also a pretty simplistic distinction. Other languages do this much better. So, I'm going to guess that some of the keen-eyed punters have noticed something in here. Our second person is the same. Singular and plural, we're using the exact same word. You'd think that would be a bit ambiguous, wouldn't you? But use is here to save the day. That's our plural. So this construction use actually makes it more logical. It removes the ambiguity. So hopefully that defense has now died in the water. Okay, so it's resolving this for us. So what's actually going on? We've now excluded the idea that it's because the language itself is more logical or because the language itself is somehow intrinsically better. It's not. Have a think about who uses it. Who uses use? Who says this? So, yes, some brave people have raised their hands. I applaud you. Thank you. So, but often the way that we perceive it, it tends to be people who are perhaps of a lower socioeconomic status. Perhaps they come from a particular place in Australia that we enjoy looking down on. Perhaps they're from people who didn't go to fancy private schools. But we're often going to consider them unintelligent. Okay, we don't need to talk about the fact that intelligence and education are not the same thing in any way at all. I think as skeptics we're reasonably across that one. Yes? Please be across that one. That's really important. So what's happening is it's the type of person. We're relating this to a type of person and then attaching all of these stereotypes to who the person is. And this is a natural human tendency. We all do it. It's just that we don't often realise that that's what we're doing when it comes to language. So we've just established there's no objective value, there's no moral value to a change in grammar, to a change in the way things are expressed. It's nothing. It's purely social. And we're projecting that onto it. And so the decisions we make about people based on how they talk, we're reacting to our own social biases. We're reacting to these ideologies we already had in the first place. We're just using language as a vehicle for it. So this is probably the topic of, again, another different talk. But we know this partly because people never agree on exactly what a particular linguistic feature means or what it's related to. But also, we can manipulate you in the lab to make you believe what we want you to believe about language. That sounds really sinister. It's less terrifying than that, but it's something that we're able to do. And from that, we've been able to figure out that it's actually just whatever bias you've got underneath. It's not relating to what's actually happening in the language. So, but what happened to our Englishman, our old friend? Our friend Englishman is somewhat hoist by his own petard here. Someone has written in, someone who signed themselves off Sydney. If Englishman's knowledge of grammar were coextensive with that of Cantab's, he would probably be aware of the fact that the subjunctive mood does not always follow if, and that only where futurity is combined with contingency is the employment of that mood strictly correct. This subjunctive devotee also censures an Australian for the same heinous offence. It is to be regretted that correspondents wander from the main point of the argument to the uncharitable criticism of each other's letters. After that, we never heard from Englishmen again. So, summing up, there's no such thing as a correct variety, just a prestigious one. And I would like to think that as skeptics, we're able to see that when it comes and to dismiss it. What we need to do is to focus on the arguments that people are making. It's a cheap shot that we can make, and sometimes it helps us to feel clever and a bit superior, but it is ultimately just a cheap shot. But because as skeptics, our job is to associate with ideas, to engage with ideas, and to challenge ideas. And we can't do that if we've written off the person they're coming from as an idiot, as tempting as it might be. So, ultimately, I guess, a handy rule of thumb, if you understood someone's grammar well enough to correct it, if you understood what they were saying well enough to be able to correct them, they didn't need your input in the first place. Thank you.
Actually, we have a couple of minutes for questions, actually, so if anyone would like to come down to a microphone, we can do some questions.
Any of yous would like to come to the
Yes.
You guys would like to go down to the bloody microphone, now's the time. But I must say that I actually work as an English teacher, so
Yes.
I think on Monday morning I'm going to drill my students in the correct use of the futurity and contingency in the subjunctive verb. That's very useful.
Yes.
All right, let's take a question.
Hi.
Hi. I was wondering about
Hang on, don't worry. If it's not working, I'll repeat you back. Just go for it.
I was wondering isn't they, them, and singular pronouns as well now, and they, them as well?
Yes, so there's a huge pushback against that, as people know. And yes, a lot of people are saying it's because it's incorrect grammar. We can't do that because it doesn't work, because pronouns aren't meant to do that. I think most of us know that's really not what their case is. That's not what they're arguing about. But I'll give you a free piece of information. People who are railing about the fact that you absolutely cannot use a plural for a singular and that just ruins everything, the singular of you used to be thee and thou. You was plural. And when people started using you to refer to a single person, there was uproar. They were ruining the pronouns. You can't use a plural to talk about a singular. I don't know, you tell me how the English language is doing.
All right, let's get a question from Ian.
Okay. So you think that the grammar is motivated by social and prestige reasons, but what about engineering standards? I've lectured for many years about numbers and units and graphs and axis labels and kilo, mega, milli, and maps without north arrows or scale bars, and basis points in interest rates, and particularly units on graphs have led to spacecraft crashing into Mars. So is engineering and science units, is they a more serious matter?
I see what, well played. I see what you did there. Yes, it's the same process of standardization where a bunch of people have gotten together and agreed that this is the one way to do things. I suppose my response to that is using a different pronoun isn't going to make a bridge fall down. Thank you.
Let's take the last question over
Hi. What's your opinion on when people mean figuratively, but they say literally?
Oh. So when people mean figuratively, but they say literally.
I would literally die.
Yep. So what's happened there is this word literally has changed to become what we call an intensifier. So it just means that you mean more of whatever it is you've just said. And yes, people are railing against that because people fear change. look, my only real response to that is language is going to change regardless of what you do, so get on board or, I don't know, live in a hut. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.